Hey, there's Mark coming to you, giving you a little bit of a overview of the Model 94 carburetor that goes on top of this old Flathead Ford. There's a fuel pressure gauge, and that's super important. That'll come up here in a minute when we talk about it. And this motor I rebuilt over the winter time. It goes in this old girl. She's looking pretty good these days. Got her repainted. And the motor runs really good. It's just the main problem I've had getting back out on the road is this little monster, the Model 94 carburetor, which everyone said is really not a problem, and that you just there's not much adjustment to it. You just stick it on there and it runs. That has not been my experience. I find it to be a pretty finicky carburetor for being such a simple design. And so I thought I'd just share with you a few things that I ran across that I think will make it easier to get yours dialed in. And this is some stuff that I've watched every video out there on rebuilding these, and these are things that they don't really touch on that much. Or if they do, they're in sporadic different places. So, one of the first things you need to do is run the right power valve in it. So Charlie Price, Vintage Speed, shout out to those guys down in Florida. He's great. He makes a really good rebuild kit that comes with the proper power valve. I think this is a 5.5 or a 5, I can't remember. Somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't think it's labeled, but it has from the underside, it's got a single level, so he machines those down so that they sit flush against the bottom when you thread it up through the bottom plate here. And also some of the regular Holley ones have a wider disc on top here, and that interferes with this little back wall sometimes. So you really, if you go on his website, you'll see he's got different power valves in that genre, so you can pick the right power valve. There's also a proper parts number for some, if you want to order it through different sources, but he's got really good ones. So onward to the good stuff. So the main problem, the first problem that I've run into, I had 3 different bases that I've ordered. All of them, the main butterfly shaft was worn out on it, just flat worn out. So you could this would just be jiggling around in here, and so you got a giant vacuum leak right away that's happening around the shaft. So this is a 5 thousandths over. He also carries these, but I carry them. Got mine from Speedway, and it was a little snug. You can use a tiny bit of 2000 grit sandpaper. So if you got to work it in there, I used a little bit of grease and just worked it back and forth, and it fell right in there. Since the metal in these bases is fairly high nickel content, most of the wear happens with the brass itself. You got to be a little careful backing out these screws. You might need to heat them up, but you don't want to strip them out. It makes it really hard to get those little butterflies out. So take your time with that. But the shaft seals. Once you get that sealed up, you've eliminated one of your big leaks. It can leak around the power valve as well. If so, you're going to see it down in here when you take these 2 pieces apart. You'll see wet gas down inside this vacuum chamber. I put a bolt under here, which makes it easy to tighten this up once the carburetor is secured here, because it's pretty tough to get a screwdriver between the intake manifold and this little screw that normally would be there. So if you just find a bolt and use that, it makes it much easier to tighten this up. And this was that gasket between these 2 bodies was one of the places that I had primary vacuum leaks as well when I started. Oh, let's see. Other places where you get vacuum leaks. The little paper gaskets that go underneath these horns are kind of garbage. Just saying it like it is. And underneath the squirter there, you can see maybe a little brown. What I did was I took and replaced all those gaskets with Viton O-rings, which hold up really well. They're a little higher density material, so you can kind of tighten those down and they seal up really well. And I had super awesome luck with those because these are not really milled, precision milled surfaces underneath here where the horns articulate with the carburetor body. underneath here. And so that took up a lot of that weird slop, and the regular gaskets are just super thin paper. So that made a big difference. I'm going to use them here on these front screws too, because these are still weeping a little bit, and they're a good candidate for that as well. I think I'm running 51 jets here. The other thing that was problematic right away was that little check ball down there. If that is not seated correctly, and you want to make sure that the spring is pointing down and pinning that in place, and make sure that spring is seated completely down inside that well also. You can tap that with a brass drift punch to make sure it's seated. I took a tiny bit of lapping compound and glued that little ball to the end of a piece of copper, and just lapped that little tiny well that sits in, just gently, very, very, very gently, and that helps seal that up. But you know, what you'll notice is it'll lay over really hard. You'll step on it, and you're not getting a good squirt out of your squirters because that check ball is not sealing well and preventing the pressure from going back into the bowl through that little hole right there. So making sure that that ball's in there and well seated is also super important. For your accelerator pump, you want one of these aftermarket polyurethane or whatever they are, plungers. The leather's probably not going to work for you too long, especially with the ethanol. And finally, bringing it home, the float level. There's a bunch of people telling you, what is it, 11, I don't even know, 11/64 or something they want you to set out. I can tell you that 1 1/4, measured straight edge up and over, will get you in the ballpark. I needed to put mine to about 1 3/8, maybe a 16th shy, to keep it from boiling over or just leaking, hot percolating once the car sits for a while. And I think almost every one of these cars I've seen out in public has gas dripping down the side of it, mostly because of where the float not being set at the right level. The needle assembly in here is one of the Charlie Price Vintage Speed roto discs, I think he calls it. And instead of a little needle in there, it's got a little synthetic disc that shuts off the gas. And that's worked really good. The needle will work, but this just seems to work quite a bit better, especially with the ethanol fuel. And the ethanol fuel wants to perk as well. Now, the PSI, that fuel pressure gauge, that's got to be right around 2 PSI, maybe 2.5 max, maybe 3 at the max. And if it's any higher than that, it's going to push past the needle and cause you a whole bunch of problems. So I'm running an Edelbrock low pressure pump, which generates about 2 to 3 PSI, and that's underneath the car. But just to make sure, I think it's a good idea to run a little fuel pressure gauge of some sort or another, so you can see what's happening. I mean, it tells you whether or not there's fuel coming up there as well. And I think mine runs at right about 2.5, and that seems to be just right to keep that fuel from pushing past the needle. It can't tolerate more than that. I've tried 4, 4.5. It's not going to hold. And if it does, it doesn't hold all the time, and it certainly won't hold once that bowl starts percolating a little bit. So there you go. Phenolic spacer too. There's also a little phenolic spacer there, which helps keep the heat from transferring up into the carburetor. Phenolic, PHENOLIC. And I think that's worth buying too. You have to replace those studs and make them a little bit longer, but that's not a big deal. So all of those things mixed together has finally gotten this little troublesome beast back to work again. Hope this helps somebody, and have a wonderful day.